In this video, we're going to talk about understanding the timeline. And to access a timeline, we're going to go down to the bottom of the screen, and we have this little section here that says Timeline, States, and Notes. We will go ahead and select that, and as we do, we can see that it expands. It decreases the slide size, but it also opens up this window down here at the bottom so we can see our timeline. Now, one of the things that I really like about the timeline with Storyline is you can undock it and you can move it around and you can put it on a different window, or you can increase the size of it. If you have a lot of objects on your screen, you actually might need to do that. So that's been a really great feature for me so far. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over here on the side, and there's this little icon. When you hover over it, it changes to blue. So I'm just going to go ahead and select that. And when we do that, we can now see that our timeline has been undocked from the bottom of the screen down here. And again, from my experience, this is a much more helpful feature than leaving it below your slide, because if we notice here, if we want to increase the timeline so we can see all of our objects, our slide also, the size of our slide also decreases, which is not really what you're going to want to do or need to do most of the time. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is this little arrow right here. I'm going to select that. That will collapse our timeline, or not our timeline, but now our states and our notes section. And now we have our timeline that's kind of just floating around out here. Now, if you have multiple monitors, at this point you can take your timeline, you can put it on a separate monitor, which is what I normally do, but for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to leave it, of course, here on this monitor, and I'm going to resize it. To do that, we just hover over the edge until you see those double arrows, and you just click and drag it however you want to resize it. I'm going to move it out just a little bit, and I'm also going to move this edge over a little bit. And also, I'm going to increase the size of this area so I can see the items or the name of the items that I have on my slide. And something that I recommend very strongly is that when you add an object to your slide, you come down to your timeline and you name it accordingly. This is going to be very helpful once we start getting into states and layers and triggers and selecting the objects that you want to trigger and so on. It's going to be a lot easier and a lot less confusing to select those items if you have named them in a way that makes sense to you and that you understand what it is. So that's why, again, I have everything named on my timeline. Now, a timeline is exactly that. It's a representation of the amount of time or the duration of your slide, the time duration of your slide. Now, if I take this, I'm just going to drag this out a little bit, and you can see that we can set the time duration of this slide for as long or as short as we want. Now, by default, all of the slides will be at 5 seconds. Now, you can increase this time or you can decrease this time. If all of your objects on the slide aren't time sensitive, if you will, then it doesn't really matter how much time they've been given, because we generally do not run our courses based on a timeline or a start and stop point on that slide. So really what we're going to do most of the time is all of the objects on the slide will be at the same length or the same duration. And 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it doesn't really matter because, again, we normally don't cue actions off of our timeline. Okay, so as we can see here, again, the default duration is going to be 5 seconds. Now, if I wanted to, I could come up here and let's say there's an item that I don't want it to show initially when the learner selects the slide. So let's say this next button, if I wanted that to come in, so let's say 2 seconds after the slide started, I just simply select the item, and then if I hover over the end of that object on the timeline, you see those double arrows, and I can just click and drag it over to whatever time that I want or need. And you can do that with any of the objects. Okay, so again, by default, everything will be at 5 seconds. Now, I will say this: if you have, let's say, a video that's 30 seconds long, once you add that to your timeline, that will push at least that object out to 30 seconds. And you have to be mindful of that if you have an object that is time sensitive, because if you have a video that's 30 seconds long and it stretches your timeline out to 30 seconds, but all of the other objects on your slide are, let's say, 5 seconds, what's going to happen is now that slide becomes time sensitive, and when the learner selects that slide, after 5 seconds, everything on that slide will disappear except the video. Now, obviously, we don't want that to happen, so again, you just have to be mindful. If you have an object or a video or an animation or something like that on your slide that is time sensitive, you're going to need to come into your timeline and increase the time duration of all the other objects on your timeline. And again, that's easy to do. All you have to do is hover over this little gray line right here, and you see the little black rectangle with the double arrows, and then you would just select that and then click it and drag it out to whatever time that you needed to. Very easy to do, but again, a very important aspect of managing your timeline if you had a video or an animation that exceeded the 5-second mark, if you will. Okay? So let's go in and look at the left part of this timeline and show you a few of the cool features there. All right. So over here on the left, again, we mentioned that we named everything, and if you wanted to rename it, you just double-click on the item, it'll turn blue, and then you just type in the correct name, hit enter, and that'll change the name of the item. Next, we have the lock box, and when I select this box, you'll see this little lock icon show up in the box. That's relatively self-explanatory, but what happens is if I select that lockbox, that particular item is going to be locked down and you can't move it or edit it or anything else. Now, most of the time you're not going to need to mark an item as locked, except for the background image. And the background image is located down here at the very bottom of my timeline. And I'm going to go ahead and select the lockbox on that, and what that does is my background image now that I added to this slide, which again was the first thing that I added, now I can't accidentally click this background image and move it, which happens a lot if you have a something that's maybe a text box or something that's transparent on your slide. And if you don't select that text box just in the right place, you may accidentally select the background image, and then when you try to move, you think you've selected the text box, and when you click and drag it, try to move it, you're actually moving the background image. And then you have to reposition the background image, and that can be very frustrating. So the moral of the story is I recommend that you lock the background image on your slide, and then you don't have to worry about accidentally bumping it or moving it and all of that. Now, you could do the same thing with your characters. If your characters are going to be stationary and you know you don't want to accidentally move those either, then you can certainly lock those down as well. Okay, so we'll just unlock that for now. And again, to lock it just as simple as selecting and deselecting. To the left of that, we see this little eye icon. And with that, any item that we select this eye icon for, that item or object or image or whatever it is going to disappear. Okay, now obviously it's still there. We just have locked it from view so we can't see it. Now, one thing I'll say here is that if you have an item or an object or an image or whatever, and you deselect this eye icon and we can't see it anymore, then once this slide or this scene or this project is previewed, it will not show up, or if you publish it, that item will not show up. So if you deselect this eye icon, then you're going to have to at some point go back in there and reselect it so that item shows back up. Unless, of course, it's an item that you don't want to see, in which case you could just probably delete it and be done with it and not have that extra object in your presentation or your course. Okay, so that's a pretty cool feature. This also allows you to, let's say you had a lot of objects stacked on top of one another and you needed to get to the very bottom object. You can select the boxes for all the items above that item, and it'll allow you to get to, if you will, that bottom object. Okay, so that's pretty helpful if you have, again, a lot of items or objects stacked on top of one another. It allows you to get to that bottom object and allows you to edit that object very easily. So pretty cool feature. The next thing that we'll look at here are groupings. Now, here's a grouping, and this is Milo. Milo's a little robot friend down here. And he consists of 3 different images. We have his body is one image, his head/monitor is another image, and we have this little arc right here, his smile, that's with a separate image. So usually the easiest thing to do when you're dealing with multiple images that are part of an overall group It's best usually just to group those together, because when you group them together, you can select that item and move it around, and everything will stay together. If you want to resize it, you can select it and resize it, and all of the images in that grouping will also be resized. Okay, so what it also does on your timeline is it groups them together. Self-explanatory. Not trying to insult anybody's intelligence here, but it'll show up as a group on your timeline. Now, this is very, very helpful if you are working with a group of images, and let's say you have 30 or 40 images in a group, and that happened to me before, where I built an animation and I had a lot of moving parts. Well, what happens on your timeline is if you have 40 objects on your timeline, that's going to be a lot of information that you're going to see over here. So a good way to manage that type of situation is to group all of those applicable items together, and then they just represent one item on your timeline as opposed to 50 items. So it's a good way to manage your objects on your slide, because in some situations it can get out of hand pretty quick if you're building a lot of your own graphics in Storyline, or if you have a lot of objects in an animation, that can get pretty hairy pretty quick. So it's usually easier just to go ahead and group those together, and then you're done with it. And if you need to access or delete or edit an object in the grouping, you can just select the arrow to the left. It'll open up and it'll show you all of the items in that grouping, and you can adjust and edit those accordingly. And of course, we have the same options. You can lock an item, or you can hide it from view by selecting that, of course. So it's a pretty cool way to manage your objects on your slide. All right, the last thing that I really mentioned about the timeline is the fact that all of these objects that are on your timeline, you can look at this like they are stacked on top of each other, because they literally are stacked on top of each other. So what you want to do is, whatever your base image is, that needs to be the bottom item on your timeline. And that's relatively self-explanatory, because you wouldn't want your background image to be covering up your main character or a text box or anything like that. So if I were to select this background image and move it up, what you're going to start seeing as I continue to move it up the list here, stuff's going to start disappearing, because those things are now, they're not gone, they're just hidden, if you will, underneath our background image. So just be mindful of that. If you have an image or an object on your slide and it mysteriously disappears, and you don't know how it happened, then just come over to your timeline or take a look at your timeline, and you can make sure that the object that you want to see is not buried under another object that it shouldn't be buried under. So again, the timeline is a very important part of how you develop in Storyline, and managing that timeline and all the objects on that timeline can be a task if you don't do it correctly. Which again goes back to my comments about naming everything on that slide, so it's easily recognizable whenever you start to build your interactions with the triggers and the states and layers and all that stuff. So again, timeline, it's not rocket science, but it's an important aspect of what we do in Storyline, and I just wanted to give you a general overview of the timeline.